They said no one ever raised their voice in that restaurant until he walked in. The doors of the Manhattan restaurant opened slowly, not with force, but with certainty. And in that single moment, the entire atmosphere shifted, as if the air itself had recognized danger not of violence, but of authority. William Carter entered first, a white American billionaire in his late 30s, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit that reflected quiet power rather than showmanship. His expression controlled but sharp in a way that made conversation die at nearby tables without explanation. Behind him walked his young son, holding onto the edge of his father's coat, his small steps hesitant, as if already aware of the weight his last name carried in rooms like this. Staff members straightened instantly, voices lowered, movements slowed, and even the sound of silverware against porcelain seemed to hesitate. William did not look around. He did not need to, because he was used to spaces adjusting themselves to his presence rather than the other way around. Somewhere deeper in the restaurant, Emily Harper stood behind the service counter, a white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a simple black apron tied neatly at her waist, her posture calm, her eyes observant as she scanned the room with quiet intelligence rather than fear. She had already noticed him before most people had even processed his arrival, not because of status, but because of pattern recognition, the way people changed when someone they feared entered a space. William's reputation was not spoken loudly, but it was known in fragments. A single father who built empires and broke negotiations with the same controlled intensity. A man whose temper never exploded, but instead lowered the temperature of every room he entered. As he guided his son toward a reserved table near the window, a small accidental moment disrupted the silence. A glass slightly knocked, a chair shifted too quickly, and instantly the surrounding staff reacted with visible anxiety, as if expecting a storm. William's gaze lifted slowly, not angry yet, but already calculating, and that was when Emily moved. She did not rush, she did not announce herself. She simply stepped into the space between tension and escalation as if she had done it many times before, her voice calm, measured, and low enough to soften the moment without challenging anyone's authority. "It is all right," she said gently, placing a steadying hand on the edge of the situation rather than the people involved, redirecting attention instead of confronting it, her expression unreadable but composed. The staff hesitated, surprised not by what she said, but by the fact that she said it at all to someone like him. William's eyes shifted toward her slowly, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, something in his expression changed, not anger, but curiosity sharpened by disbelief, because unlike everyone else in the room, the waitress in the black apron did not look afraid of him. Inside the restaurant, the moment after the initial disruption lingered like a held breath that no one dared to release, and the entire room seemed to recalibrate around the presence of William Carter, a white American billionaire in his late 30s whose reputation for control was felt more than spoken. He had not raised his voice, he had not made a gesture, yet every staff member moved with sharper precision, as if silence itself had become a rule in his presence. His young son sat quietly at the table by the window, small hands resting on his lap, eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment with a kind of cautious awareness that children develop when they sense emotional pressure without fully understanding it. William remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his attention slowly shifting away from the table and toward the surrounding space, not in search of comfort, but in silent assessment of how quickly people adapted to fear. That was when his eyes returned to Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s, still wearing her black apron neatly tied, moving calmly between tables as if nothing in the room had changed at all. She was not avoiding his gaze, nor seeking it. She was simply continuing her work with a level of composure that felt almost unnatural in contrast to everyone else's tension. William observed her carefully now, not as background staff, but as an anomaly. Most people reacted to him in predictable ways: fear, overcompensation, silence, or excessive politeness, but she had done none of those things. Instead, she had intervened earlier with a voice that did not challenge his authority, yet did not submit to it either. And that balance was something he was not accustomed to encountering. A server approached his table cautiously, offering water with hands that trembled slightly, but William's attention did not follow the glass. It remained on Emily as she adjusted a nearby table setting with precise, almost unconscious efficiency. His son suddenly shifted in his seat, looking toward Emily with a small expression of curiosity, as if drawn not to status or fear, but to the calmness she carried in contrast to the rest of the room. William noticed that too. He narrowed his eyes slightly, not in anger, but in analysis, as if recalculating an equation that no longer produced expected results. Emily, meanwhile, continued working through her section, placing orders, checking tables, and quietly correcting small inefficiencies in the flow of service without drawing attention to herself. When a minor delay occurred near the kitchen pass, she spoke briefly to a colleague, not commanding, not complaining, but redirecting with clarity that immediately restored order. William watched that exchange closely, and for the first time that evening, something shifted in his perception. This was not simply a waitress performing her duties. This was someone who understood systems, people, and timing at a level that went beyond her role. He finally sat down at the table, his movements controlled but slower than before, as if his mind had temporarily stepped away from habit. Across the room, Emily briefly looked in his direction, not with hesitation, not with concern, but with a steady, neutral awareness that acknowledged his presence without being influenced by it. That brief moment of eye contact lasted less than a second, yet it was enough for William to realize something unexpected. The restaurant did not revolve around him the way it did for everyone else, because for at least one person in the room, his reputation was only one variable among many, not the defining factor. The restaurant had settled into a controlled rhythm, yet beneath the surface of polished service and quiet conversation, an invisible tension continued to circulate around the presence of William Carter, the white American billionaire seated near the window with his young son. After observing the space for several minutes in silence, William remained unusually still, his attention no longer focused on the surrounding guests, but increasingly directed toward patterns of behavior he could not immediately categorize. His son sat across from him, occasionally glancing around with soft curiosity, while the noise of the restaurant continued in carefully moderated waves. Emily Harper moved through her section with consistent precision, her black apron tied neatly, her posture steady, her expression calm in a way that did not seek validation from anyone in the room. William noticed that she did not change her behavior even when passing his table, nor did she attempt to adjust her tone or movement in response to his presence, which stood in direct contrast to everyone else. A server nearby hesitated before approaching his table, clearly aware of who he was, but Emily crossed the space first, subtly redirecting the workflow so that the delay was resolved without disruption. There was no announcement, no visible instruction, only a seamless correction that restored balance to the service flow. William observed this carefully, his analytical mind beginning to register something unfamiliar beneath the surface of routine hospitality. He had spent years in environments where control was explicit, where authority was acknowledged immediately, yet here control appeared indirect, distributed, and almost invisible. His son suddenly leaned slightly forward, watching Emily as she placed a dish on another table with calm efficiency, and for a brief moment, the child's attention lingered on her rather than on his father. William noticed that shift immediately. It was subtle, but meaningful, because children did not respond to status, they responded to emotional safety. Emily returned toward the service station, adjusting a small discrepancy in order timing with a quiet exchange to the kitchen staff, her tone even and composed. William's gaze followed her movement without interruption, his expression tightening slightly not with frustration, but with a growing need to understand what he was seeing. Most people in the room behaved as if influence radiated outward from him, yet Emily acted as if she existed within a different framework entirely, one governed by observation rather than intimidation. When she finally paused near the edge of the dining area, she briefly looked in his direction again, not as a reaction, but as a confirmation, acknowledging presence without surrendering attention. William did not speak, yet internally he recalibrated his initial assumption about the evening. This was no longer a simple visit with his son, nor a routine dinner in a familiar environment of deference and control. Something in the structure of the room had shifted, not because of him, but because of someone who had not changed her behavior in response to him at all. And that realization, quiet but undeniable, began to occupy more of his attention than anything else in the restaurant. The restaurant continued operating in a carefully maintained rhythm, but beneath the surface of polished service and quiet conversation, the presence of William Carter, the white American billionaire seated near the window with his young son, had created an invisible distortion in how everyone moved and spoke. Yet what unsettled William most was not the usual reaction he expected from people who recognized him, but the absence of that reaction in a single individual. Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, continued working through her section with calm precision, unaffected by the psychological pressure that normally followed him into any public space. A small incident occurred near table 7 when a dish was delayed due to miscommunication in the kitchen, and several staff members instinctively tensed, anticipating frustration from his table. Before the situation could escalate, Emily moved into position with controlled timing, adjusting the flow of service with a brief exchange that redirected the kitchen priority list without raising her voice or drawing attention. The correction was subtle, almost invisible, yet within moments the delay resolved itself and the service rhythm returned to balance. William observed this closely, his attention narrowing not on the outcome, but on the method. There was no visible assertion of authority, no appeal to hierarchy, only precise intervention at the exact point where disruption would have spread. His son, sitting across from him, followed Emily with his eyes again as she moved between tables, his expression calm in a way that contrasted with the usual guarded awareness he showed around unfamiliar adults. William noticed this shift again and this time did not ignore it, because children did not respond to reputation or wealth, they responded to emotional stability. Emily returned to the service counter, briefly reviewing handwritten notes, then adjusted a seating arrangement request with a quiet correction that prevented overlapping table assignments during the upcoming reservation wave. The manager glanced at her briefly but did not question the adjustment, as if her input had already been implicitly validated through repeated reliability. William slowly leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her movements, no longer analyzing her as an anomaly of behavior, but as a structured system operating independently of external pressure. In every environment he had ever controlled, authority created order through fear or compliance. Yet here order seemed to exist through anticipation and silent correction rather than instruction. Emily paused for a brief moment near the center aisle, her attention scanning the room with controlled awareness, and for the third time that evening, her eyes met his without hesitation or avoidance. There was no challenge in her expression, no submission either, only recognition of presence without alteration of self. William did not speak, but internally something shifted again, because he realized that for the first time in a long time, his presence was no longer the dominant variable shaping the environment. Instead, it was being accounted for, measured, and quietly integrated into a system that continued functioning regardless of his authority. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had settled into a refined equilibrium, yet beneath its polished surface, an undercurrent of psychological tension continued to evolve around William Carter, the white American billionaire seated with his young son near the window. The earlier incidents had faded into controlled silence, but William's attention remained partially detached from the dining experience itself, anchored instead on the subtle structure of behavior unfolding across the room. Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, continued her work with consistent precision, moving between tables with an efficiency that appeared almost invisible until one observed how smoothly everything functioned in her vicinity. A new moment of disruption began when a guest at a nearby table raised a concern about timing, creating a brief ripple of tension among staff members who instinctively glanced toward management. Before escalation could form, Emily adjusted her trajectory mid-movement, subtly coordinating with another server through a brief exchange that redirected responsibility and prevented overlap in service tasks. The correction was not dramatic, nor visible as authority, yet within seconds the tension dissolved and operations stabilized again. William observed this carefully, his eyes tracking not the resolution itself, but the absence of friction in how it was achieved. There were no commands issued, no visible chain of authority enforced, Yet the system corrected itself around her presence, as if responding to an unspoken framework only she could see. His son, seated across from him, quietly followed Emily's movement again as she passed their table, his expression softer now, less guarded, as if the environment itself felt more predictable when she was nearby. William noticed this behavioral shift and found it increasingly difficult to ignore. Children did not interpret wealth, reputation, or intimidation the way adults did. They responded to emotional stability, and Emily seemed to provide that without any deliberate attempt to do so. At one point, Emily paused briefly near the beverage station, reviewing the flow of incoming orders and making a small adjustment to preparation timing that reduced delay in a sequence of deliveries. The effect was immediate but subtle, and even the kitchen staff responded without questioning the adjustment, as if her decisions had already been implicitly validated through experience. William's gaze remained fixed on her, and for the first time that evening, his internal assessment shifted away from evaluation of personality and toward recognition of pattern design. What he was witnessing was not improvisation, but structured awareness applied in real time. Emily was not reacting to the environment. She was anticipating it, shaping it through minimal intervention. When she briefly turned her head and her eyes met his again, there was no change in her expression, no sign of discomfort or acknowledgement of hierarchy, only a steady awareness that treated his presence as one variable among many within a larger system. William did not speak, yet his perception of the room had fundamentally changed. The restaurant no longer revolved around his authority or influence. Instead, it functioned with a quiet stability that persisted regardless of him. And at the center of that stability was a waitress in a black apron who did not appear to be trying to control anything at all, yet somehow ensured that everything remained under control. The evening light outside the Manhattan restaurant had begun to fade into a deeper shade of gold and blue, casting long reflections across the polished floor as the final dinner rush started to build. Inside, William Carter, the white American billionaire seated near the window with his young son, remained unusually still, no longer reacting to the environment with his typical detached authority, but instead observing it with a level of attention that felt increasingly unfamiliar even to himself. The earlier disruptions had not escalated, yet something more subtle had taken their place, a quiet restructuring of house space. Timing, and people interacted around a single consistent presence. Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, continued moving through her section with the same steady precision. But now William was no longer simply watching her movements. He was studying their consequences. Every action she took, no matter how small, appeared to prevent imbalance before it occurred. A delayed order was corrected before a complaint formed. A seating conflict was resolved before management intervention was needed, and even emotional tension at a nearby table softened when she briefly passed by without engaging directly. There was no visible authority in her behavior, no attempt to direct others, yet the environment consistently adjusted itself around her presence as if unconsciously aligning to her decisions. William's son, sitting quietly across from him, leaned slightly toward the edge of the table, watching Emily as she approached with a water refill. The child's expression had shifted from curiosity to a calm attentiveness, as if the atmosphere itself felt safer in her proximity. William noticed this shift again, and this time he did not dismiss it as coincidence. Children responded instinctively to emotional stability, not status or reputation, and Emily seemed to generate that stability without effort or acknowledgement. As she placed the glass down and continued forward, Emily briefly adjusted the timing of a passing server with a quiet, almost imperceptible instruction that prevented two service paths from overlapping near the kitchen entrance. The adjustment was so subtle that no one reacted to it, yet the flow of movement in that section of the restaurant immediately became smoother. William observed this carefully, his analytical mind no longer focused on what she was doing, but on how consistently the environment adapted to her smallest interventions. It was not control in the traditional sense, not command or enforcement, but something closer to predictive correction, as if she were continuously reading outcomes before they unfolded. For the first time that evening, William leaned slightly forward, his attention fully anchored on her rather than the room as a whole. Emily paused near the service station, scanning a sequence of incoming orders and making a minor adjustment to preparation order that eliminated a potential delay cascade in the kitchen. The staff followed the adjustment without hesitation, not because they were instructed to obey, but because the correction made immediate operational sense. William's gaze remained fixed, and internally, something shifted further. In every environment he had ever dominated, structure was maintained through visible hierarchy, through authority that demanded recognition. Yet here, structure was being maintained without recognition at all, through quiet anticipation and precise intervention that left no trace of disruption. When Emily briefly looked in his direction again, there was still no acknowledgement of rank or pressure, only the same steady awareness she had shown from the beginning, as if his presence had never altered her internal framework of understanding. William did not speak, but his perception of the entire room had now fully changed. What he had initially interpreted as a waitress moving efficiently through her job had become something far more complex, a silent system of control that did not rely on fear, status, or instruction, but on an almost invisible intelligence embedded in every interaction she touched. And for the first time in years, William Carter found himself no longer observing the room as its center, but as one element within a structure he did not fully command. The final moments of dinner service approached in the Manhattan restaurant, where soft golden lighting blended with the dim reflection of the city skyline beyond the glass windows, and William Carter, the white American billionaire seated with his young son, remained in a state of controlled silence that was no longer rooted in authority, but in deep internal recalibration. The earlier perception he held of the environment had dissolved gradually over the course of the evening, replaced by a more complex understanding that no longer allowed him to interpret the room through hierarchy alone. Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, continued her work with the same steady rhythm. But William now noticed something different in how he perceived her presence. It was no longer about isolated actions or efficiency, but about continuity, the way every movement she made seemed to maintain equilibrium across multiple layers of activity simultaneously. A small delay formed near the kitchen pass when a sudden influx of orders created potential bottleneck pressure, and without drawing attention, Emily adjusted her position, exchanged a brief, quiet instruction with a colleague, and altered the sequence of delivery in a way that prevented escalation entirely. There was no visible recognition of authority, no moment of disruption, only immediate stabilization, as if the correction had been anticipated before the problem fully formed. William's son, seated across from him, had become noticeably calmer throughout the evening, no longer scanning the room with uncertainty, but instead resting his attention intermittently on Emily whenever she passed nearby. That behavioral shift was not lost on William. It was subtle but consistent, and it challenged a foundational assumption he had always held, that stability was created through control, not presence. Emily returned briefly toward the service station, reviewing timing sheets and adjusting one sequence of preparation notes that would have otherwise resulted in overlapping table deliveries during peak flow. The adjustment was accepted without question by the kitchen staff, not out of deference, but because it immediately improved operational clarity. William observed this moment with increasing focus, his earlier analytical distance now replaced by sustained attention. What he was witnessing was not improvisation, nor coincidence, but an underlying structure of awareness that seemed to extend beyond her immediate role. She was not reacting to the environment in real time. She was continuously predicting it, shaping it through minimal, precise interventions that left no visible trace of disruption. For the first time that evening, William's internal sense of dominance over his surroundings no longer applied. The restaurant did not feel like a space responding to his presence. Instead, it functioned as a self-regulating system in which his presence was simply one of many inputs, not the defining factor. When Emily briefly looked in his direction once more, there was still no acknowledgement of status, no change in expression, only the same calm awareness that had remained constant from the beginning. In that moment, William Carter realized that the true center of stability in the room had never been his authority, but something far quieter, something he had not yet fully understood, embodied in a waitress who never once needed to prove she was in control in order to maintain it. As the evening deepened inside the Manhattan restaurant, the lighting shifted into a softer, more intimate tone, reflecting off polished surfaces and glass windows, while the final wave of guests settled into quieter conversations. Yet for William Carter, the white American billionaire seated with his young son, the atmosphere no longer felt like a familiar environment of control, but rather a layered system he was still trying to decode. His attention, which had once been anchored in authority and expectation, remained fixed on Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, whose presence had gradually redefined how the room itself functioned around her. A subtle disruption occurred near the central dining area when a coordination mismatch between two service paths created a brief overlap in table assignments, a situation that normally would have escalated into visible confusion during peak service. Before any staff member could react, Emily adjusted her movement pattern mid-step, exchanged a brief quiet instruction with a colleague, and redirected the flow in a way that prevented interruption entirely. The correction was so seamless that most guests remained unaware anything had happened, yet William saw it clearly, not as a single action, but as part of a continuous predictive structure she seemed to maintain without effort. His son, seated across from him, had become increasingly calm throughout the evening, occasionally glancing toward Emily whenever she passed nearby, as if her presence alone stabilized his attention. William noticed this pattern again and again, and it began to challenge something fundamental in his understanding of influence. In every environment he had ever led, stability was enforced through authority, pressure, or expectation. Yet here stability emerged without any visible assertion of control. Emily moved toward the service counter again, reviewing timing sequences and adjusting a preparation order that eliminated a potential delay cascade in the kitchen workflow. And once more the staff accepted the adjustment without hesitation, not because it was instructed, but because it immediately resolved inefficiency before it could manifest. William's gaze followed her continuously now, no longer evaluating individual behaviors in isolation, but trying to understand the underlying principle governing them. What he was witnessing was not reaction, but anticipation, not correction after error, but prevention before disruption. The distinction was subtle, yet it fundamentally undermined everything he had assumed about leadership and control. Emily paused briefly near the edge of the dining floor, scanning the room with quiet awareness, and once again her eyes met his without hesitation or change in expression. There was no acknowledgement of his status, no shift in posture, no attempt to adjust behavior in response to his observation. She simply continued to exist within her own framework of awareness, as if his presence did not redefine her role in the system. William slowly exhaled, his internal perspective shifting further away from judgment and closer to recognition that the structure of this environment was not centered on him at all. Instead, it functioned around something far quieter, far more consistent, something that did not demand attention yet consistently maintained balance in its absence. For the first time that evening, William Carter understood that control did not always announce itself through dominance or fear, and in that realization, the waitress in the black apron became not an anomaly within his world, but the point from which his understanding of it began to change. The restaurant had now fully transitioned into its late evening rhythm, where conversations softened into murmurs and the glow of Manhattan outside the windows blended with the controlled elegance of interior lighting. Yet for William Carter, the white American billionaire seated with his young son, the environment no longer felt predictable or centered around his presence as it had in every other space he had ever entered. His attention remained anchored on Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, whose movements had become the defining structure of balance within the room, without any visible attempt to assert control. A subtle situation unfolded near the far end of the dining section when a timing mismatch in order delivery threatened to create overlapping service interruptions, a scenario that typically would have escalated into visible confusion among staff under pressure. Before any disruption could fully manifest, Emily adjusted her trajectory with quiet precision, exchanging a brief and almost imperceptible instruction with a colleague that realigned the sequence of service flow, preventing any visible delay or guest dissatisfaction. William observed this carefully, not as an isolated correction, but as part of a continuous pattern that suggested she was operating on a level of anticipation rather than reaction. His son, seated across from him, now appeared noticeably more relaxed than earlier in the evening, occasionally watching Emily with a calm attentiveness that contrasted sharply with the emotional tension that had initially defined William's arrival. This change did not go unnoticed by William, because it directly challenged his long-held belief that stability in any environment was the result of authority and control. Emily continued her movement through the restaurant, briefly reviewing preparation timing near the service counter and adjusting a sequence that prevented a potential bottleneck in kitchen output, again without drawing attention or requiring confirmation from management. The staff accepted the adjustment immediately, not out of deference, but because the correction aligned naturally with operational efficiency, reinforcing the sense that her decisions existed within an internal logic the rest of the system instinctively followed. William's gaze remained fixed on her, his internal analysis shifting from observation of behavior to recognition of structure, as he began to understand that what he was witnessing was not improvisation or intuition alone, but a consistent framework of predictive awareness applied in real time. Emily paused briefly near the center aisle, scanning the room with quiet focus, and once again her eyes met his without hesitation or acknowledgement of hierarchy, maintaining the same calm neutrality that had remained unchanged from the beginning of the evening. There was no reaction to his status, no visible adjustment in demeanor, only steady awareness that treated every presence in the room as part of a larger system rather than a source of influence. William slowly leaned back in his chair, his perception of the environment continuing to shift as he realized that the restaurant no longer revolved around him or anyone else with recognized authority, but instead functioned through a quieter and far more consistent intelligence embedded within a waitress who never needed to announce control in order to maintain it. And in that realization, his understanding of power itself began to quietly transform. The restaurant had entered a quieter phase of the evening, where the final guests settled into slow conversations and the lighting softened into a warm, controlled glow across polished tables and glass surfaces. Yet for William Carter, the white American billionaire seated with his young son near the window, the atmosphere no longer carried the familiar weight of authority he was used to commanding in every space he entered. His attention remained consistently anchored on Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, whose presence had gradually become the stabilizing force of the entire environment without any visible effort to assert dominance or control. A small shift in service demand occurred when a sudden cluster of table requests converged within the same time window, creating the potential for overlap and delay across multiple sections of the restaurant. Before the pressure could escalate into visible disruption, Emily adjusted her movement pattern with calm precision, exchanging a brief and quiet instruction with a nearby colleague that redistributed tasks and rebalanced timing across the service flow. The correction was immediate in effect but invisible in execution, preventing any guest awareness of the underlying tension that had briefly formed. William observed this not as an isolated action, but as a continuation of a consistent pattern he had been tracking throughout the evening, where every potential imbalance appeared to be resolved before it fully surfaced. His son, seated across from him, had become noticeably more at ease, his posture relaxed and his attention occasionally drawn toward Emily whenever she passed within view, as if her presence created a subtle sense of emotional stability within the space. William registered this change with increasing awareness, recognizing that the child's response was not influenced by status or reputation, but by something far more instinctive and human, a sense of calm that did not require explanation or authority. Emily continued her work through the dining area, briefly pausing at the service station to review timing coordination sheets, where she made a minor adjustment to the preparation sequence that eliminated a potential bottleneck in the kitchen workflow before it could develop into delay. The staff accepted the adjustment without hesitation or discussion, not out of deference to hierarchy, but because the correction aligned immediately with operational efficiency and restored natural flow to the system. William's gaze remained fixed on her, his internal perspective shifting further away from traditional interpretation of leadership and control and moving toward recognition of a different kind of structure, one that operated through anticipation rather than reaction. Emily paused near the central aisle once more, scanning the room with steady awareness, and when her eyes met his again, there was still no acknowledgement of status or pressure, only the same calm neutrality that had remained unchanged since the beginning of the evening. In that moment, William understood more clearly than before that the restaurant no longer functioned around visible authority or hierarchy, but through a quieter and more consistent intelligence embedded within a system that responded not to power, but to precision, and at the center of that precision stood a waitress who never needed to announce control in order to maintain it, fundamentally reshaping his understanding of what true influence actually meant. The final stage of the evening inside the Manhattan restaurant carried a softened rhythm, where the lighting dimmed slightly and conversation slowed into more private tones. Yet for William Carter, the white American billionaire seated with his young son, the experience had shifted far beyond a simple dinner into something closer to observation of a living system he no longer fully controlled. His attention remained fixed on Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, whose presence had become the quiet organizing force behind the entire environment without any visible assertion of authority. A minor disruption emerged when a sequence of overlapping service requests threatened to create delay between two adjacent sections of the restaurant, a situation that typically required managerial intervention or visible correction. Before any escalation occurred, Emily adjusted her position within the room with calm efficiency, exchanging a brief and nearly imperceptible instruction with a colleague that redistributed responsibility across the service flow, neutralizing the potential delay before it reached guest awareness. William observed this carefully, no longer focusing on the outcome alone, but on the consistent pattern of prevention rather than reaction that defined her presence. His son, seated across from him, appeared increasingly relaxed throughout the evening, occasionally glancing toward Emily with quiet curiosity, as if her presence created an emotional anchor that made the environment feel stable and predictable. William registered this behavioral shift with growing attention, recognizing that it was not influenced by status, wealth, or authority, but by a more fundamental sense of calm that required no explanation. Emily continued through her section, briefly pausing near the service station to review timing coordination notes, where she made a subtle adjustment to preparation sequencing that eliminated a developing bottleneck in the kitchen workflow before it could manifest into visible delay. The staff accepted the adjustment without hesitation, not as an instruction imposed from above, but as an immediate correction that naturally improved system efficiency. William's internal perspective shifted further at this moment, moving away from evaluating individual actions and toward recognizing a broader structural intelligence that appeared to govern interactions within the space. What he had initially interpreted as efficient service had now revealed itself as continuous predictive awareness, where disruptions were identified and resolved before they fully formed. Emily paused briefly near the central aisle, scanning the room with steady and composed awareness, and when her eyes met his once again, there was still no acknowledgement of hierarchy or influence, only the same consistent neutrality that had remained unchanged throughout the evening. William did not speak, yet his understanding of the environment had fundamentally transformed, because he now recognized that the restaurant did not operate around visible authority or imposed control, but around a quieter and more consistent system of anticipation. And at the center of that system stood a waitress who never needed to assert power in order to ensure that everything remained in balance. The Manhattan restaurant had entered its final phase of evening service, where the remaining guests spoke in lower tones, and the lighting softened into a warm, subdued glow that reflected gently off glass surfaces and polished wood. Yet for William Carter, the white American billionaire seated with his young son, the environment no longer felt like a space he could interpret through the familiar language of authority or control. His attention remained fixed on Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, whose presence had gradually become the invisible framework holding the entire room in balance without any outward display of dominance. A subtle disruption began near the far dining section when a brief overlap in service timing created the potential for delayed table coverage during a peak sequence of orders, a situation that typically required managerial coordination to prevent visible confusion. Before any escalation could occur, Emily adjusted her movement path with quiet precision, exchanging a brief and almost imperceptible instruction with a colleague that redistributed responsibilities across the service flow, eliminating the delay before it reached guest awareness. William observed this moment with heightened focus, no longer seeing it as an isolated correction, but as part of a continuous pattern of anticipatory awareness that defined her entire presence within the space. His son, seated across from him, had become increasingly calm throughout the evening, occasionally glancing toward Emily whenever she passed nearby, as if her presence created an emotional stability that required no explanation or instruction. William noted this change carefully, recognizing that it was not driven by authority, wealth, or status, but by a quieter and more fundamental sense of predictability that the child responded to instinctively. Emily moved toward the service station again, briefly reviewing timing coordination sheets and adjusting a preparation sequence that prevented a developing bottleneck in the kitchen workflow before it could manifest into visible delay or disruption. The staff accepted the adjustment without hesitation, not because it was imposed, but because it immediately restored operational balance in a way that felt natural and necessary. William's internal perception shifted further at this point, moving beyond observation of individual actions and toward recognition of a deeper structural intelligence that appeared to govern the entire environment through anticipation. Rather than reaction, what had once seemed like efficient service now revealed itself as continuous predictive correction, where potential problems were identified and resolved before they could fully form. Emily paused near the central aisle, scanning the room with steady and composed awareness, and when her eyes met his once again, there was still no acknowledgement of hierarchy, no adjustment in behavior, only the same calm neutrality that had remained unchanged from the beginning of the evening. William did not speak, but internally he understood with increasing clarity that the restaurant no longer functioned around visible authority or imposed control, but through an invisible system of awareness and timing. And at the center of that system stood a waitress who never needed to claim power in order to ensure that everything remained in perfect balance. The Manhattan restaurant had reached its final moments of service, where the remaining guests spoke in softened tones, and the glow of city lights outside the tall windows blended with the warm interior lighting, creating a calm visual contrast that no longer reflected the psychological tension that had defined earlier in the evening. William Carter, the white American billionaire seated with his young son, remained still at the table near the window, but his stillness was no longer the controlled posture of authority he had carried upon entering. It had transformed into something quieter, more reflective, as if the structure of his understanding had been subtly rewritten without a single direct confrontation. His attention remained anchored on Emily Harper, the white American waitress in her mid-20s wearing a black apron tied neatly at her waist, whose presence had gradually become the unseen mechanism maintaining balance across the entire restaurant. She moved through the final service cycle with consistent precision, closing small gaps in timing, aligning table transitions, and ensuring that no disruption carried forward into the closing phase of operations. Each adjustment she made appeared minimal on its own, yet together they formed a continuous correction of the environment that prevented instability before it could surface. William observed this with a level of focus that no longer belonged to evaluation, but to recognition. He was no longer asking what she was doing, because that question had already been answered repeatedly. Instead, he was beginning to understand how she was doing it without ever needing to be seen as the source of control. His son, seated across from him, sat quietly with a relaxed posture, occasionally glancing toward Emily as she passed, his expression calm in a way that suggested emotional safety rather than curiosity alone. William noticed that this calmness had been consistent throughout the evening, unaffected by the earlier tension that had initially accompanied their arrival. It was not something imposed, nor instructed. It was something naturally present whenever Emily was within the child's awareness. As Emily completed another adjustment near the service station, coordinating final timing sequences with the kitchen staff, William watched as the system responded instantly, without resistance. There was no visible hierarchy being enforced, no command issued, yet the result was immediate alignment across multiple moving parts of the environment. At that moment, William's perception shifted fully from observation to understanding. What he had interpreted as efficiency earlier in the evening was now unmistakably a form of anticipatory intelligence, where outcomes were stabilized before deviation could occur. Emily paused near the central aisle one final time, scanning the room with steady composure as the last guests prepared to leave, and once again her eyes met his without change, without acknowledgement of status, without adjustment in expression. In that brief moment, William Carter understood that nothing in this space had ever been revolving around him in the way he had assumed. The restaurant had not been responding to his presence, nor to authority in any traditional sense. Instead, it had been functioning through a quiet and continuous system of awareness that required no recognition to remain effective. And at the center of that system stood a waitress who never once needed to claim importance, because her presence alone had already ensured that everything remained in balance.